It's constantly flipping the paper, and I think I was there for about a month or so. So I finally found out that they were doing Bambi. I'm mainly a landscape painter anyway, so I work up the tiny sketches and bring it in and show it to him. Tom Cotterick, he said, "Gee, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm doing in-betweening." He said, "Maybe we put you in the wrong department."
Walt had a wonderful way of organizing and finding talent, and a typical Walt Disney discovery by seeing his work. It was sometime later that we realized he had this marvelous color sense, and that you'll see in the film itself.
So that's how eventually the style of Bambi came about. Tyrus Wong just needed a job in the Big Depression.
What Tyrus Wong brought to the art direction is just absolutely stunning. And he had thousands of small-scale and large-scale sketches that were very lyrical and had that poetry that Walt wanted.
When you take a step back from the story, which is hard to do with Bambi, but if you can, take a step back, turn off the sound, and just start looking at every image, you will be so stunned at how every scene is like this exquisite painting of nature. Not realistic, in fact very stylized, but it represents that feeling of being in the forest.
It's the forest of your dreams and the forest you experience rather than the forest you actually see. And that's very much the aesthetic in Chinese landscape paintings.
At that time, Chinese influence just came natural with me.
We realized the simplicity of Ty's backgrounds. You could still get all the color you needed with simple forms. Then the main characters would show up beautifully in front of that.
I think Walt was fortunate to have Tyrus Wong working there to come up with that concept.
Although he's a very modest man and doesn't realize it, even today there are young artists who still look to him as one of the great talents ever to work in that area of design.
It was transcendent, it really was. It's just absolutely beautiful and very unlike anything that we had ever done before at this studio.
All of us, when we start out, we look to, what the masters did, and that's what, they're a bunch of masters. They paved the way. And so to see what Tyrus has done, and it's giving you inspiration to kind of branch out yourself and explore new areas that haven't been done before, because that's what these guys did.
How much do you respect a stroke of brilliance? And I think that Tyrus was one of these painters that kind of come in and left his mark.
It never dawned on me that that's an influence,
Disney had this thing he called the plausible impossible. He said our movies don't have to be real, they have to be plausible. And yet what we're creating on the screen is completely impossible. And Bambi's a great example of that. Deer don't talk, and skunks and bunnies don't talk, but they do in Bambi. And this world seems very real and very alive. Big part of that is the backgrounds, the atmosphere, and the visual effects that go on when you're seeing the film.
You've got flowers growing, you've got leaves blowing in the fall, and then you've got the forest fire. All of these things that happen out in the natural wild, you have to recreate those.
And what people don't realize sometimes is all that had to be drawn. All that had to be drawn frame by frame in exactly the same way that the characters had to be drawn.
There was also a lot of development going on in the camera department and doing optical effects.
Walt was always had experiments going on in smaller films that he could adapt to the larger films. On the old mill painting, they established the effects of the ripple glass.
Ripple glass was optically ground glass that had a pattern to it, and when you move that under the lens over artwork, you got this ripple water effect. You created these beautiful moments in water. They also used ripple glass for the fire, and it really created some heat distortions.
The effects were so groundbreaking. When there's snow, you couldn't just animate snowflakes by just hand draw them. They did all kinds of experimentations by dropping cornflakes and filming that in slow motion and then bleaching it or just making it look white, and that was the right effect, sort of these cornflakes falling.
Time magazine talked about a Disney artist being arrested for lying on his back on the sidewalk, staring up and not wanting to be moved. I don't know if that really happened or not, but the point is it could have really happened if he was a special effects guy, because what he wanted to know was, what do the raindrops look like as they come toward your eyeballs, because we want to put that into the Little April Showers number.
They filmed live-action rain on a soundstage against a black background, and we're still using those film elements 60 years later. We use them in Little Mermaid, we use them in Pocahontas, in Lion King, and so there's a great sense of history and of paying homage to those early visual effects artists.
Walt and his team were always looking for ways of creating dimension in their work, and you really saw this in a big way in the build-up to Snow White. They knew that to sustain a feature-length animated film, it couldn't just be a cartoon that was long. It had to actually have production values. And one of the things they tested in a short called The Old Mill was the multiplane camera. So it was taking a background painting, and instead of painting it on one piece of paper, they would break it off on several sheets of glass, maybe 4 or 5 deep. And so if you had a farm on a country road, you would see a piece of the fence and the mailbox, and on the next piece of glass you would see a piece of the road, and then on the back you'd see the barn. And when you put a camera there and shot through all those layers of glass, you would get a really interesting feeling of perspective.
If you look at that multiplane camera shot, it takes you deep into the forest in the very first sequence of Bambi. The main thing it did was it gave the illusion of depth. And Walt wanted you to see depth because that's the way he saw that forest.
There were shots that are just vistas that have so much depth you feel like you can just reach in and walk into that frame.
It's great, and it's all part of the storytelling. All those effects, just like every other aspect of the film, the painting and the design and the animation, it's all that work that they put into that really made it pay off and make it such a great piece of art.
Well, the result is, it's up there on the screen. You can see it, and you've been there before. You know the whole forest.
We look at Bambi and say, wow, that has all the romance of a beautiful old handwritten letter or a beautiful hand-done painting. And we see that. We see the humanity up on the screen in every way, and I think that's part of the reason we react to it the way we do.
Isn't it amazing how subtle the music is in Bambi? You don't really realize how swept away and enveloped you are by it. Through that music, you actually enter the forest.
It's making nature itself a character and bringing it to the screen in a way that certainly no one had done in animation before, and I think very few people had even attempted to do in live action.
And I realized that it was a pastoral symphony, just as Beethoven wrote, which was something that was in their minds at the time, clearly, because Fantasia was being completed at the same time. A pastoral symphony for children. Every cell that you see, every background, is completely brilliant work. But the impact of a motion picture, the succession of images of film, is glued together by the music. This is why music has always been part of movies.
There's a beautiful scene where Bambi has fallen down and all the rabbits go, "Get up, Bambi, get up."
Come on, get up. Come on, get up, Bambi. Get up.
And he has a way of getting up with doing one leg first and then the other leg catches up. It's just gorgeous. And that's all done to music. And that unity between music and animation is just fantastic.
That Disney cared so much about music cannot ever be overstated. Music was as important to him as anything that happened on the screen.
I think Walt realized that music was going to have to play an exceptional role in Bambi because the dialogue is so minimal. He would very often make the artists storyboard sequences in mime, and then only at the very last minute could they add what dialogue they absolutely couldn't do without.
From the beginning of Bambi to the end of Bambi, there's almost not a moment without music. There are two 18-second silences. One is when Bambi's mother says,
"Man was in the forest."
and there's complete silence. I mean, 18 seconds is a really long time. And the other time is after Bambi's mother dies. These moments of silence are powerful because they're surrounded by wall-to-wall music.
There were 2 Academy Award nominations for Bambi. Both had to do with music. The song Love is a Song was nominated and sung behind the credits by Donald Novis, who was a very important singer at that time. And also the scoring was nominated as well.
The main composer behind Bambi is Frank Churchill. His music, his themes, his motifs were taken and then arranged into the final score. And Edward Plum did what you would call secondary scoring. Plum was a musical director for Fantasia, so when you hear some of his music in the film, it definitely has a more classical sound than Frank Churchill. Frank Churchill had had a huge success with Snow White. He had written all the songs and a lot of the underscoring, and those were songs that were on the hit parade. They were extremely popular. He wrote Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf from the Three Little Pigs.
Who's afraid of the big bad wolf, big bad wolf, big bad wolf?
His melodies were very simple, very catchy, and very memorable. He was relatively untrained, but an intuitive natural musician who could come up with endless melodies.
His on-the-job training was to play music for silent movies. What a lot of people don't realize is that when silent films were being filmed, the actors and actresses were being put into the mood of the scene by somebody playing a piano. And Frank Churchill used to improvise the moods for these different scenes. That experience made him the ideal person to set the mood, as it were, for a skunk named Flower or a little bunny named Thumper or for Bambi.
I remember clearly how we were involved with the first rainstorm, and we wanted a raindrop song that would show Bambi experiencing the first raindrops. And we didn't have anything at the time, and finally Frank Churchill came in one day. Frank was quite a character. He shuffled down the hall, and he always wore his hat. And he sat down at the piano wearing his hat, crossed his legs over, and he puts one foot on the pedal, reaches in his pocket and takes out a little script, puts it down on the piano, and then starts to tinkle off on the piano there this little raindrop song. And it was so charming, it was unbelievable.
Somebody could take a chord and nothing, but Frank Churchill could take it and it's the creative genius that Frank Churchill had.
The way he makes us feel nature and yet write simple tunes of all different kinds of qualities is really quite interesting in Bambi. Ed Plum, who was the other composer, is said to have studied with Johann Strauss, which is very believable. There's no question that between the two of them, they create a world of the past, maybe when we might have been closer to nature.
And it's really amazing that the score is so unified because you have the very sophisticated work of Edward Plum with its echo of Stravinsky and Ravel, and then you have the very childlike melodies of Frank Churchill. You have the main title, which is the Love is a Song theme, which is sung by a tenor, and then you have the music for the forest waking up, and it's just a very simple theme, but very lovely. The man motif, which was just a simple three-note progression down here. And here's a melody that Edward Plum composed for the autumn sequence. Almost every measure of that is a different chord. The whole film just has emotional power to it generated by the musical score.
Bambi is the first feature film of any kind where songs were sung off camera, not by the characters themselves, in order to pass on the narrative.
When you have less than 1,000 words of dialogue in a film, your ear really hungers for sound. 40-voice choir, 4 individual artists singing beautiful, lovely, melodic tunes. A feast of music with this broad-ranging orchestral score.
When you look at Bambi today, you're aware of Walt Disney's seriousness of his purpose in entertaining. What a high level he set. We now are the recipients of this tremendous vision, and we just now almost take it for granted. If you look at it really carefully and listen to it really carefully, you're amazed at how far they push the envelope. I don't think Bambi would be Bambi without its music.
Of all the deer in the forest, not one has lived half so long. That's why he's known as the great Prince of the Forest.
Bambi the book was published in 1928 and written by an Austrian author named Felix Salten. And actually he did 6 books, 3 of which were turned into Disney films, Bambi, Perry, and then The Hound of Florence, which became The Shaggy Dog.
How does a novel written by a man who works in an insurance office in Vienna, who's bored out of his mind and starts to write the story Bambi, how that gets to Disney is already an amazing story. And it involves, of course, World War II. It involves everything that's going on at that period.
Felix Salten's book came to Walt's attention by a fellow named Sidney Franklin in 1935. He was a producer and director of live-action films at MGM. And his films always had a great understanding of character and story and a lot of heart. Films like Goodbye Mr. Chips, Mrs. Miniver. Salten's book was a natural for Sidney Franklin. He optioned the film rights in 1933, and for a couple of years he played around with making an actual live-action version of the film.
Sidney Franklin liked the book very much, but he didn't think that it was possible to do a picture that had that much emotion with the animals.
So he realized the true medium for making Bambi would be animation, and my gosh, who better in the world to do this than Walt Disney, the king of animation. So he approached Walt Disney with the book.
And the book itself had a lot of poetry and beautiful scenes in it, and dramatic scenes. And when Walt heard about it and read the book and saw what the possibilities were, he became extremely enthused about it.
I think Walt was always somebody he was a nature guy. He liked nature, he liked the seasons, and he liked the outdoors.
And so from that aspect, I think it was very close to his heart, and one of the reasons why he poured so much of himself into it.
This is the kind of film he wanted to make, and it would be in advance. And so he risked everything. He was such a successful guy after Snow White, and he puts it all on the line again, immediately. I mean, who does that now? It's incredible, incredible.
In the early 1940s, they had already done the impossible. They made Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. They had done the next impossible, which is that they had made Fantasia and Pinocchio. The last thing they really needed to do was like outdo themselves, and yet they decided to push the envelope one bit forward.
That endless experimenting was very much Walt's personal style.
I always refer to the making of Snow White, where everybody was saying you can't make a feature with animated cartoons. It's not going to work. A lot of people thought that, including animators. And when Walt came in and told the animators, he said, you know, my idea is...
Dwarfs' names fit their personalities.
This guy here, maybe he is grumpy. He'll be different. He's not just another little old man. He'll be a grumpy little old man. And then this man here, we'll make him sneezy, maybe. He'll sneeze.
This little fellow is bashful. He's secretly in love with Snow White.
By the time Walt got through telling him about his characters, everybody's saying, yeah, I think we could do that. Yeah. Well, that's how Walt was.
That kind of restless creativity that was never satisfied, that was always looking a couple of films ahead, I think is very clear in Bambi. And when you see the process by which it was developed, he's still experimenting and exploring and looking for, okay, where can we take this?
This great work of art, Bambi, came from the most chaotic time in the Disney studios. really the time that Bambi was in production, from about 1936 to its release in 1942, was a roller coaster ride for Disney and the studios. It was a very tumultuous time.
In 1939, the Nazis marched into Poland. The world was plunged into war. Disney lost their European market. Pinocchio did not make a profit.
It was somewhat of a scary time. I mean, there was a feeling of unease in Europe at that time, and financially things were not all that rosy.
And Walt ended up in debt to the Bank of America.
And he called over Mr. Giannini from the Bank of America, and he came over with his entourage of all the men in the dark suits, and they were all going to stand there and listen to Walt try to sell them on the idea of getting more money into this picture. And Walt started to tell the story. And I've never seen a man sell a story or an idea better than Walt. Walt was the greatest actor at that time. And I saw Mr. Giannini and his entourage watching all of this, enthralled with Walt and the story of Bambi. We got the money. Walt was the best salesman I'd ever seen. In fact, if I had the money, I would have invested in it.
And along about 1940, you have some labor unrest at the Disney studio. It was really a time of union organization, especially in the studios in Hollywood. And with the financial problems that Disney was facing, there were rumors rampant at the studio about potential layoffs. The Screen Cartoonists Guild was run by a real tough, hardline laborer named Herbert Sorrell, whose very name would bring most studio bosses to their knees. He went in with a meeting with Walt and said, you need to sign with me. Walt refused. He said, no, it's not my place to do that. I want to put this to a vote. I'll go with whatever my boys want. Sorrell had lost before on a vote, and I think he realized that he didn't have a majority of the artists. And he threatened Walt with a strike. Walt was adamant. He was not going to sign with Sorrell's union unless the boys voted it. Sorrell left, and the situation worsened. Tempers flared until on May 29th, 1941, Walt was surprised the studio had come under a strike.
Well, Bambi was still in the early stages of production and pre-production during the strike, but that was such a watershed in the history of the Disney studio and the history of animation that its impact was felt and still echoes down the decades. I don't know that any of the key artists on Bambi went out on the strike. They were in a different area physically.
We hardly knew that the strike was happening, and I naively just came into work every day.
My sympathy at that time was very much with Walt, when he realized who he was, the origin of his pictures, and to have it taken away from him by the strikes.
And then finally, they brought in a government mediator, and the government mediator settled the strike if Walt would take 2 strikers for every person that didn't go out on strike. And that's what happened to the studio.
Then the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. We got in the Second World War.
The war had an enormous impact on the Disney studio.
The war turned our studio into a military reservation. All our facilities were devoted to making films for the war effort.
And actually, you know, the studio was taken over. So he survived that way.
By the time of Bambi's release in August of 1942, the world had been at war for almost 3 years, and the United States had been at war for 9 to 10 months.
I find it maybe it overlaying emotion to the picture, but the idea that it opened in August of 1942 during the war in London. The world premiere was in London, right in the middle of it all.
I mean, Bambi was much realer and intense dramatically than audiences might have been expecting from an animated film.
Well, as a matter of fact, Bambi didn't make a profit on the first release.
Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Bambi all lost money initially. Since then, of course, they've gone on to reap millions, but it took those films a while to be recognized for what they were by the general public.
Walt should have been rewarded tremendously for Fantasia, for Dumbo, for Bambi, but the public was just simply on to global domination.
But Walt was the eternal optimist. Now, even though we have the deer facing trials and tribulations and the loss of his mother, ultimately everything ends up all right. And that was sort of what was going on at the studio, is here Walt was going through all the trials and tribulations of the strike, the financial problems in the war. And I think internally he was an optimist. He felt that everything would turn out right, and that was Bambi.
Bambi's a movie with great poetry and elegance and artistic integrity, but at its core is something very emotional, and of course that's Disney storytelling at its best.
This world could use some of the messages, that little beautiful story of Bambi.
A film like Bambi will never get old. It's timeless.
It really stands alone as one of, the great motion pictures ever made.
People talk about the philosophies, the art value, the animation, and the styling of that picture as being the epitome of the art of animation. Glad to have been part of that.
The 1940s were one of the most pivotal decades of the 20th century. In 1942, the world was at war, fighting by land, by sea, and by air. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in the White House, Winston Churchill was Prime Minister of England, and Joseph Stalin, leader of the USSR, was Time magazine's Man of the Year. Those left behind did their best to keep up morale. The USO was formed to lift the spirits of military personnel worldwide. Benny Goodman was leading the band, and Walt Disney was changing the face of family entertainment. Disney Studios had been working on Bambi for 6 years and was eagerly anticipating its release. But with World War II raging overseas, the military called upon Walt to use his facilities to make educational, training, and patriotic films.
Walt Disney orders his famous cartoon characters into battle dress. They're in popular demand as emblems for the armed forces.
Walt complied and halted all commercial production, except for Bambi. Did you know that in 1942, a house in the United States could be bought for less than $7,000? A car cost a little over $1,000. You could buy a movie ticket for about a quarter, ice cream for 15 cents, and soda pop was only a nickel. While big shoulders, elegant suits, and hooded coats were in style, and elaborate hats were all the rage, many women in the U.S. and abroad took to wearing slacks in the workplace. In baseball, the St. Louis Cardinals beat the New York Yankees 4-1 in the World Series. And in boxing, Joe Louis KO'd Buddy Bear to retain his title as heavyweight champ. Television was still in its infancy, so families gathered around their radios for news and entertainment. Couples were jitterbugging on the dance floor, and popular tunes leaned toward the romantic and sentimental. Bing Crosby's recording of White Christmas, heard in the hit film Holiday Inn, was #1 for 11 weeks. The lights on Broadway were dimmed, but not extinguished that year. George Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, Irving Berlin's This Is the Army, and Thornton Wilder's Pulitzer Prize-winning play, The Skin of Our Teeth, commanded standing ovations. Movies were as popular as ever, offering escapism, inspiration, and romance. Mrs. Miniver, starring Greer Garson, was the highest-grossing picture of the year and went on to win 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Actress.
Greer Garson wins the award for her unforgettable Mrs. Miniver.
Disney released 19 animated shorts, starring Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Goofy, and Pluto. Designed to delight fans at home and honor the men overseas. Promoted as a love story,
Walt Disney, the world's greatest storyteller, brings the world's greatest love story to the screen.
Bambi.
Bambi was released on August 13th, 1942, and people lined up for blocks to see the new Disney animated feature film, making it one of the top 10 films of the decade. In 1942, we celebrated the arrival of many men and women who have influenced our world.
Many of Walt Disney's ideas in terms of the development of the original Bambi do exist, and notes about his thoughts on the original film that could become the launch pad for Bambi 2. So it continues to have one foot very firmly in Walt's original concept.
One thing that is really fun is look through those old story notes from Bambi and read Walt's comments. And there was an interesting scene after the mother has been shot and the father was walking into the forest with Bambi. And Walt wasn't happy about how it was being played because they were talking to each other. And Walt said, I think this will play silent. And if you look really, really closely, you can see the mouth moving just a little bit. It gives us an idea to explore that whole situation, and it really became the springboard for Bambi and the Great Prince of the Forest.
Bambi and the Great Prince of the Forest takes place right in the middle of the original film.
Your mother can't be with you anymore.
Right after Mom is shot by the hunters.
Poor little fella. If I can be of any help.
It's what happened to him. How did he find love again? How did he find family again? And especially in this father figure he doesn't know and who's very cold and distant.
How would the father deal with the situation? Because now he's almost stuck with Bambi, with his youngster that he's supposed to raise. So I think it's the perfect moment to explore, really, for an encore for Bambi.
It's very intimidating to be working on a sequel to such a beautiful film. I would be lying if I said I wasn't a little scared.
I've got a high standard to live up to.
I was actually thinking, I don't think I can do this. I mean, I've been animating for almost 25 years now, but these characters are so difficult to draw. They have such degree of realism, and you really, really have to know your anatomy.
This is a really important, like immensely important part in the making of the movie, the study of the actual real-life deer.
You cannot just look at the old film, you have to also find out what the old animators were dealing with, what they researched, and so that means real forests, real deer, study those, and incorporate that into your work.
The ultimate goal for us is to have the original Bambi next to the new Bambi, and we want it to almost look identical.
One of the things we tried to maintain from the first movie is the artistry that went into the backgrounds, the animation, the acting. I mean, it was all at their height.
It's my turn!
We have an amazing group of child actors. The voice of Bambi, Alexander Gould, is an amazingly talented young man.
Play is a healthy part of a young deer's development.
Who also did the voice of Nemo for Finding Nemo. We have another actor who's playing Thumper.
They've been after me all morning.
And he just brings an enormous amount of fun and spontaneity and energy to his part. I suppose the biggest, most wonderful thing about the movie is Patrick Stewart as the Great Prince.
Me walk with pride.
Patrick Stewart, I think, adds such a sense of dignity. And yet, it's a very sympathetic voice.
Now you've had it!
You can hear him think and how he feels about his son and how he goes through that change.
If I'd not felt that the fundamental philosophy of what Walt Disney was attempting with Bambi had been part of the approach to Bambi 2, I wouldn't have been involved with it. But it seems to me to take seriously its historic connections in terms of tone and quality.
I have great responsibility to live up to this legacy, and I'm very honored and I feel very proud.
I think more than anything, I'd like an audience to see the movie and really feel the struggles that Bambi goes through, and also have some sense of how he's healed from the death of his mother.
I hope they take away a feeling of hope. and that even through difficult times, if you persevere, things can grow new again.
Boy, am I glad to see you.
It is very gratifying to find oneself part of this extraordinary legend.